enlightening, and I filled up my cup of alkaline water, and I'll try to do a good job for you. This is a little unusual, I think, for this group because, you know, I am a lawyer, I'm not a physician, and we're going to be talking about stem cells, and I'll be talking a little bit about what this is. Maybe you'll be getting a little more law and policy than you are accustomed to, but I think hopefully at the end of this talk you will all see that you're all stakeholders in this big public debate, and it's a vital issue, and it's an issue that's very important to healthcare. Just to let you know a little bit more about the Genetics Policy Institute. It is a nonprofit organization, and we consider ourselves a leading defender and promoter of the field of stem cell research and regenerative medicine. And this does not only include embryonic stem cell research, adult stem cells, iPS cells, all of the tools that we believe are necessary to find a way to advance regenerative medicine. And stem cells are part of regenerative medicine. If you think of one day treating medical conditions and diseases, not with surgery and not with drugs, but by rebuilding damaged tissues and organs with cell therapies. This is a new way to approach the afflictions that we have, that we are burdened with. And I would submit to you that this is a paradigm shift and a revolution in medicine. And where scientific and medical revolutions used to take decades or centuries even, now we live in the information age. We've been able to sequence the human genome. So these things might impact our lives, and if not our lives, certainly the lives of our children and our grandchildren. Now, March 9th, this month, was a very big day for those of us who are stem cell advocates, those of us who favor embryonic stem cell research, because President Obama addressed the nation and had a wonderful conference with advocates and scientists in the audience, and he announced a change in stem cell policy. And this was very significant because now he is allowing, by executive order, and eventually it will be codified in legislation, no doubt, a funding from the National Institutes of Health for stem cell lines, embryonic stem cell lines, that go beyond the lines that were created by and allowed by President Bush to be funded back on August 9th, 2001. So stem cell lines that have been created since then are now eligible for funding. And he said, and I'm just going to have a little quote, and we'll tie it together. He said, "As we restore our commitment to science and resume funding for promising stem cell research, we owe a debt of gratitude to so many tireless advocates, some of whom are with us today, and many are not. Today, we honor all the names we don't know who organized and raised awareness and kept on fighting, even when it was too late for them or for the people they love. And we honor the people we know who use their influence to help others and bring attention to this cause, people like Christopher and Dana Reeve, who we wish we could be here to see this moment." And as part of my talk, I'm going to explain to you about my own encounter with Christopher Reeve, who played an important role about how I became involved in this field. Now I'm going to share, in a way of little introduction, how I got involved in this field, because after all, I'm not the obvious choice. In fact, I was a practicing attorney in Miami, Florida, for many, many years, some 25 years, and trying cases. It was a good day when I would come home and say I sued someone. And I got involved in a very unusual case. And if you remember, at the very end of 2002, a group claimed they cloned a baby. Do you faintly remember that incident? And what happened is a group called Clonaid, the so-called human cloning company, and it was part of a UFO sect called the Raelian Movement. And a woman strode to a microphone with long copper hair and a French accent at a Holiday Inn in Hollywood, Florida, and she said, "We've done it. We have cloned the first baby." And this CNN broke in live at this announcement, and everyone was agog. You know, did this really happen? Human cloning, you know, a new age. It was the zeitgeist of the time that reproductive cloning of babies was just around the corner. And it was something that was widely feared. After all, we've produced sexually, reproduced ourselves from the dawn of time. That's what humans are about. And here, asexual reproduction, it was very big news. So I, like many of the stunned observers watching CNN that day, were thinking, you know, why did they do this at the Holiday Inn in Hollywood, Florida? They didn't even pick the Diplomat. But anyway, what I was really thinking at the time as I watched it is that I had actually helped my daughter in middle school with a paper on Dolly the sheep. And I knew that you couldn't clone a person safely. I knew that. And because I'm a well-read person, I knew this group had testified before Congress and appeared before the National Academy of Sciences, proclaiming their intention to clone. Who was foisting these people, this weird group, before the public and really considered it a threat? And as I'm thinking about that and realizing that they were influencing the public policy debate over something called therapeutic cloning, or what the scientists call somatic cell nuclear transfer, a form of stem cell research, I began to think, well, someone should see if they are really telling the truth. And a long time ago, I was a family lawyer, and I remembered about filing a dependency petition. And if this group had really cloned this child, and we're making this announcement in Broward County, Florida, the next county up from where I practiced, you know, we could test whether they're telling the truth. We could file, or I could file, a motion for temporary guardian to test the truth, to bring these people before the court and determine whether this was truth. And I thought maybe this would be a footnote in some law journal, the first case to protect a human clone, and would see what would happen. So on New Year's Eve 2002, I typed up this petition, and I drove it up to the Broward County Courthouse, and I filed it. And that night, my wife and I are watching CNN, and across the ticker on the bottom, it says, Florida attorney Bernard Seigal seeks custody of cloned baby. And my wife turns to me and says, Bernie, what did you do? Well, what I had done is I had intervened in some giant worldwide cause celeb. And a couple of nights later, I get a call, again from CNN. It says, you know, Mr. Seigal, Rael, the leader of the Raelian movement, has said they're not going to do the DNA test that they promised the world because you're trying to take the baby away from the mother. And a couple of nights after that, really when all I wanted to do was watch my beloved Miami Hurricanes play in the Fiesta Bowl, I found myself debating Rael on world television. And Connie Chung asked him the most unbelievable question ever asked on television. She said, Your Holiness, how's the world to think you're anything but a megalomaniac having sex with your followers doing this for publicity? And he says in a French accent, well, you would not talk this way to the Catholic Pope. And I was thinking 5 days ago I was an ordinary attorney, now I'm debating a deity on world television about human cloning as I look at him in his Star Trek outfit. Well, you would think, you know, high comedy, right? But it turned into a serious case, you see, because I ended up serving papers and they hired attorneys, and I became the subject of searing media scrutiny around the world as to why I had intervened in this case. And I served papers, and it turned into a very, very real case. And it played out on the world stage, on world television, in courtrooms for 30 days. I was entitled to take depositions of the principals of the so-called human cloning company. And you know what I found? They didn't have a street address. They didn't have a board of directors. They were nothing more than a sham. Well, I ended up actually cross-examining Dr. Basilier in court, and she testified that there was a cloned baby, and the baby was born in Israel. But by the time that was over, and Florida didn't have jurisdiction, the bubble had burst. And the view of the whole hearing and the whole 30 days was that the people claiming they were cloning were publicity seekers. And not only did it burst that bubble, it burst the bubble of other would-be cloners, folks like Dr. Zavos in Kentucky and Dr. Antoneri in Italy, and that they looked like publicity seekers as well. Well, after the case, when I was ready to return to civilian life, I had interacted with experts, top scientists, because one thing trial lawyers do, we might not have a background in medicine or in construction engineering or whatever case we're bringing to court or taking to a jury, but we work with experts to learn these narrow fields. And because I was under such scrutiny as to why I had intervened in this, I had reached out to leading experts as well. So two top scientists, one Dr. Rudolf Janisch at MIT, and the other Ian Wilmot, the father of Dolly the sheep, both said, you know, Bernie, you were the only one to stand up to these cartoon scientists. And we need a legal mouthpiece, because in the 1 minute that we have on CNN or Fox News or MSNBC, and we may be debating someone with a political agenda or someone who's a charlatan, how's the public to understand who's telling the difference? And you seem to be a persuasive voice. Well, I thought about that. And you know, at times in your life, you sort of feel that you have a calling. And I'm a cancer survivor myself. I had colon cancer 11 years ago. And it's a cliche in a way, but it was a wake-up call. And I said, you know, I'm going to explore this. And I want you to know I never went back to the day-to-day practice of law, that I met every stakeholder that I could. I went to and met the head of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. I met the heads of the Biotechnology Industry Organization. I had a conference with Leon Cass, Dr. Leon Cass, of the head of the President's Council on Bioethics at the time. I attended the first meeting of the International Society of Stem Cell Research, and I decided this is something that I want to do with my life right now. So we created the Genetics Policy Institute to be an advocate for this field. And what I learned was so interesting is the politics of stem cells were such a wedge issue in American politics. And the comments I'm going to make, and I want you to know, I'm going to talk a little bit about former President Bush here. I don't see stem cells as a Democrat or a Republican issue. I see it as a human issue. And I'm going to talk frankly to you about the debate, not knowing what your own political views are or what your religious views are. It doesn't matter. It's all of interest and it's of broad topics, and some of you may disagree with what I have to say, and I respect that. I often debate the foes of this research, but just as a good courtroom attorney, you shake hands when you're done and understand when there are differences. But I feel this is a very, very vital field. So what I learned about this is way back on August 9, 2001, when President Bush gave his first address to the American public, it was about stem cells. President Clinton had, as he left office, had directed NIH to create rules to allow research on embryonic stem cells. All right, well, what are embryonic stem cells anyway? And this is a sophisticated audience, and you come every month and hear from distinguished doctors and practitioners, and you might know more about it than I do. But I'll talk to you about it a little. Embryonic stem cells are basically blank cells, cells that are undifferentiated. They haven't formed a specific tissue yet. So therefore, they have the potential of turning into any kind of tissue of the human body. So where do these cells come from? They come from human embryos. Where do the embryos come from? Well, in IVF treatment, infertility treatment, in vitro fertilization, a woman goes through a super ovulation, a hormonal cycle. She's given hormones, and will produce, let's say, a dozen embryos. It's an expensive process. You're not going to just take one egg. You're going to get a dozen eggs. So you're going to hedge your bet, so you won't have to go through the procedure again. Then they're taken into the back room where the embryologists, and they're fertilized with the male's sperm. And out of that, you will have a number of viable embryos. And the physician will examine them, and the best ones, one or two, will be implanted into the woman's womb. And hopefully one day it won't be Octomom, but they'll have, you know, a beautiful baby. And the others are frozen. Some, by the way, are discarded right away. They may not be viable. They could be used for medical research, but otherwise they're medical waste. And the ones that look good will be frozen. And there's some 600,000 frozen embryos in IVF clinics around the United States. Eventually, if they're not used for a future fertility treatment, they're going to be discarded as medical waste. Some may be donated to research. Very, very few may be adopted by another couple, but maybe there have been 80 incidents of that. It's not a really popular option. So it's from these embryos that are donated to science that researchers can extract from the embryo a microscopic dot of 150 cells, smaller than a pencil dot, in a petri dish. And they will extract these cells and they will put them in a growth serum, and they will produce tremendously, by tremendous numbers. And that colony of cells is a stem cell line, okay, an embryonic stem cell line. The embryo is destroyed in the process. Now, if you come from a culture or a religious belief and you see that this embryo in a dish is a person, if you see these cells in a person, even though they've never been in a womb, even if they will never go into a womb, even if they're going to be discarded as medical waste as a person, then you have a moral objection to this. And in the United States, it's mainly social conservatives. You know, the church, the Catholic Church, the evangelical movement, has a religious view pertaining to these cells in a dish, these embryos. It's their view. It's a worldview. And people have worldviews. That's why this is such a contentious issue. So when President Bush made his announcement to the United States at that time, he actually narrowed what President Clinton was going to do. The rules and regulations that Clinton had called for NIH to enact were never enacted, were never drawn up. And President Bush said, since the deed has already been done, the embryos had already been destroyed, and there were some 21 stem cell lines available for research. He says, I'm going to allow NIH funding for those stem cell lines only. But any after-acquired lines, after-produced lines, no federal funding. Now, this is a serious business because, to paraphrase Irv Weissman, the Stanford scientist and a preeminent stem cell scientist, he has said that the greatest engine for scientific advancement in the history of man is National Institutes of Health funding. Some $28 billion a year, and this year there's going to be a $10 billion stimulus, goes to fundamental medical research. And in the past 8 years, that has been largely on the sidelines of this promising field of research of embryonic stem cell research. A very significant thing. Now, I'm going to talk a little policy that you've never heard before, and some of you are going to nod off. But I think some of you might be interested about the root causes or the root rate-limiting factor of this. There's something in the annual appropriations bill for the Department of Health and Human Services that funds the National Institutes of Health, and it's a rider, a perennial rider to the bill that's passed every single year. And it's called the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, named after retired Congressman J. Dickey of Arkansas and Senator Wicker of Mississippi. And what that passes every year without debate, single debate, it says no federal money can be spent from NIH on any research that's going to harm or destroy a human embryo, right? They can't spend the money. So therefore, when scientists want to derive new stem cell lines and an embryo is destroyed, There's no federal money for that, to derive and create this stem cell line. And because of that, if you are a woman that has fertility problems, you can't understand how an embryo develops. The research directly on the embryo and the derivation, money isn't available for that research. So Dr. Renee Pera, who we were talking to yesterday at the Commonwealth Club and at the CERM meeting at Stanford, who's an embryologist and studies this, says because this federal money is denied to derive these embryos, many more embryos are destroyed unnecessarily through IVF treatment. But nevertheless, that's the rule. So you're scratching your head and you're saying, well, okay, but what did Bush do? You just told me he was going to allow limited funding, and now Obama's allowing funding. Well, here's the key. If the researcher doesn't use federal money and derives an embryo, now we can use federal money to research the resultant stem cell line. There was an opinion called the RAB opinion by a lawyer in the Department of Health and Human Services that if no government money was used in destroying the embryo and creating the stem cell line, the resultant stem cell line can be available for funding. So that's what the Dickey-Wicker Amendment is. But it's because of this rule, there's a crazy situation that developed that's a real problem. Because if I used one little glass pipette, if I was a researcher deriving a new stem cell line, and that pipette was funded with NIH money, and I do this and destroy this embryo to create a stem cell line, my entire institution's NIH grant is at jeopardy. So what happens? We find duplicate labs being set up, extra equipment, complex bookkeeping systems, all because of this policy. And the sad thing about this is this Dickey-Wicker Amendment, and indeed this whole debate, has turned into a proxy in the roiling debate over abortion in the United States. And we need to understand that issue. And that is an issue, it's still bubbles and with vitriol, doesn't it? It's just part of the fabric of America now. And some of the social conservative groups that were very much opposed to Roe versus Wade in 1974, that was based on a woman's right to privacy that allowed first trimester abortion, because of that, some of the foes of the research in the think tanks like James Dobson's Focus on the Family and the Family Research Council and the Discovery Institute that believes in teaching intelligent design and teach the alternative in our school system, and the American Enterprise Institute and others that have actually created bioethics agendas, you see, they thought that if they could constrain human embryonic stem cell research and use the same terminology that these are the rights of the unborn, and in fact create personhood to the embryos in a dish, somehow that would dent the abortion debate. So as they pressed on with this, and you follow the money, and it's millions and millions of dollars go to these think tanks, they were creating the talking points related to this. So as I was getting involved with the Genetics Policy Institute, I became very interested in exploring these arguments and understanding them, and understanding the talking points that the foes of the research were using. And it always troubled me that many of these groups were not stepping up and saying, we oppose this for our religious beliefs. Because, like it or not, it is a worldview, and you respect a person's religious beliefs. And they may disagree, and we live in a democracy, and sometimes things happen that we don't want, maybe a war that we don't support, but nevertheless our tax dollars go to support that war. We live in a democracy. But rather than say that, I found in the debates that I began to have with the foes of the research, whether on television or universities, and I've spoken at 35 universities around the world on this subject and had many, many debates, I would find some of the arguments I believe to be dishonest. And they come into the vernacular and the fabric of the debate. One of them, a fellow I debated, Dr. David Prentice at the Family Research Council. And a very awfully nice guy, by the way, outside of the thing we were debating, which was at the University of Michigan Medical School. And he threw up a slide, I remember, that really got me mad. And it was of a football scoreboard. And the football scoreboard said, adult stem cells, 72, embryonic stem cells, nothing. And the implication is that embryonic stem cell research is junk science. And the argument goes there are 72 treatments and or cures with adult stem cells and 0 with embryonic stem cells. And how unfair is that? Adult stem cells found in the bone marrow are used for treatments in leukemia and blood-related diseases and help in dealing with chemotherapy. And in fact, there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of trials going on with adult stem cells, and it's very, very promising. But in Dr. Prentice's list of 72 treatments, he's including Parkinson's and spinal cord injuries and anecdotal reports, and it was nothing more than a gross exaggeration. And embryonic stem cells were only discovered by Dr. Jamie Thompson at the University of Wisconsin back in 1998. Okay, a decade ago, 11 years ago, and we're just now having the very first clinical trial. Geron Corporation down at Menlo Park is doing the first limited clinical trial for spinal cord injury right now. So this is a pretty significant situation, and it's not one that you can say and use a false alternative argument. They're like trying to say, we don't need that embryonic stem cell research, we've got all this great alternative there. I would argue that we need to use all the tools in our possession to advance this field to fight chronic illnesses and alleviate human suffering. And why should we do this with one arm tied behind our back? It wasn't right. And what had happened with the ascendancy of the Bush White House and the elevation of some of the social conservative views is that we also found that the debate would turn over the issue of cloning. You always hear this term cloning. After all, that's how I became involved with this. So let's talk about that. What the heck are we talking about? Oh, you support stem cell research. You're in favor of human cloning. Well, I realized from the cloning case, I was like the only person in the world ever to take a public stand and sue someone that was trying to clone someone. All right? You couldn't say to me that I wasn't against reproductive cloning of babies. I actually had the credentials to say it, and I think it's almost the same as incest. It's something we shouldn't do, and it's a whole other story why it's unsafe. It's really a terrible form of experimentation, and there's no ethical way you're going to do human reproductive cloning. But what about cloning of cells that everyone was getting hysterical about? Now, let me talk about that a second. If we were going to do therapeutic cloning or somatic cell nuclear transfer, and it has so many different names, no wonder the public is confused about it. Let's say I take one of my 100 trillion body cells, a skin cell, to be born a skin cell and to die a skin cell. And I take a human egg that's donated, and I remove the DNA, and I put this microscopic little cell into that egg, apply electricity, a serum, and all of a sudden, that skin cell, already differentiated, right? It's a skin cell, turns into an embryonic cell to match my own DNA. So maybe, as the science progresses, we will be able to derive then a stem cell line, and we'll be able, if I have a bad heart, to be able to regrow my own heart tissue, matching my own DNA, all right? That's the promise of it. Might be a repair kit, our own individual repair kit. So that's what therapeutic cloning is. There's no vision of that embryo that's created. There's no sperm involved. It was my cell, all right? There's no vision that that's going to be a mini me, a clone Bernie, but that it's going to be something that could be used. And scientists could create stem cell lines that were burdened by disease. If I had diabetes, that stem cell line could have diabetes, and we could look and use it as a tool for drug discovery, right? And figure out how it develops. So this is the valuable thing. But the foes of the research wanted to blur this because it was a form of embryonic stem cell research and saying you're trying to create life to destroy it. And because of that, Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, a very social conservative senator, tried to create a bill, or did file a bill, and in the House it was called the Weldon-Stupak bill, that actually passed several sessions. And that said all cloning, unethical reproductive cloning, and therapeutic cloning were to be criminalized. And a scientist who would do it would go to jail for 10 years and have $1 million fine. And a patient who might go abroad for this, if it ever came to pass, and came back with those cells, would also be imprisoned for 10 years and have $1 million fine. And in different... No, it's not shot, not shot. Only 10 years imprisonment. And in fact, if you went to Michigan, the law in the books is that it would be a $10 million fine, not $1 million fine. So this hysteria about cloning was playing out. And remember back in 2002 when I said the zeitgeist was this was around the corner, this was a big deal. So the cloning issue on this nuclear transfer has become this giant symbol, whether it's happening or not. And it seems like the stem cell science is actually passing this by and large, with some new cell discoveries we can talk about. But the idea is that this was the issue. And since as a culture, we watch all these movies, Attack of the Clones, and have this underlying fear of biotechnology, like in the movie I Am Legend, where a virus wipes out most of mankind and turns the rest of us into vampires. You know, and read next, and in book after book and popular culture, there's this hysteria, this pop culture fear of biotechnology, fear of mad scientists. And feeding off of that, the foes of this research were trying to paint this in the corner. So what happened, interestingly, and what the next part of my own journey, is I found out that the Bush administration was actually pushing in the United Nations a world treaty that would ban not only unethical reproductive cloning, but this therapeutic cloning as well. I had gotten this group of scientists together and created my 501c3 organization. And the first initiative that we wanted to do was to go into the United Nations, which was debating this treaty. And I proposed the matter be taken to the World Court, the International Court of Justice, maybe declaring reproductive cloning only a violation of international law. So when I was in the United Nations, I learned that sadly the administration, in my view, was pushing full bore to get this ban. And my group became the leading whistleblower relating to this. And we organized, with all the patient groups and scientists, a campaign against this. We ended up faxing 35,000 fax letters to the United Nations. And in October 2003, we were able to save this research by a single vote. A single vote. So if anyone tells you that one person can't do anything, you know, I'm the living proof that, you know, you can make a difference. But trust me, my 10th grade biology teacher would really be surprised that I'm doing this. All right. Well, we were invited, my group was invited to stage a science conference in the United Nations, and over many objections, I was able to get it sponsored by the Asian Group Legal Experts meeting because this battle was still ongoing, and I created a science conference for the United Nations on human cloning and other issues, and we were able to present that. It was, if I get a Lifetime Achievement Award, the challenge of a small non-governmental organization without a track record to put a conference in the UN, that was hard to do. But I was able to do that, and then started organizing policy and advocacy summits that have turned into the World Stem Cell Summit, which really is the largest stem cell conference of this kind in the world. This year it's going to be in Baltimore on September 21st through the 23rd at the Baltimore Convention Center with Johns Hopkins and the University System of Maryland. And at the conferences, and I've had one at Stanford and with the Harvard Stem Cell Institute, and last year at the University of Wisconsin, and we bring in advocates, political leaders, ethicists, legal experts, scientists, and we present everything in a giant collaborative effort along with industry to try to advance this entire field forward. It's a very significant thing. So what has happened as a result of the foes of the research pushing so hard to ban this research and criminalize it? What has happened is something that's quite amazing. There has emerged almost a counter movement, what I call a consumer movement, the pro-cures movement. And what is this consumer movement? It's not a political movement. This isn't a political issue. But it's individuals who see stem cell research as a personal health issue, not a public health issue, as a personal health issue, something that might impact their own lives, their loved ones, and their friends. And it is this movement that spawned political action in California, in Missouri, and in Michigan that by ballot initiative have protected this research as a fundamental right in their state constitutions. What an unintended consequence of the overreaching of the other side. And to illustrate even more, and using the California example, the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine in Prop 71, which passed in 2004, and I think, Ben, it had like 7 million votes, right? 7 million votes. It was amazing. By a landslide, Californians decided to do this. And in the absence of federal funding, which has been a relative pittance compared to the NIH $28 billion budget, we find California stepping up through bond sales to create $3 billion of funding for this entire field. And you know, it wasn't the politicians that thought of this. It was the civilians that did it. Interesting civilians, by and large. Folks like Doug Wick and Lucy Fisher and Jerry and Janet Zucker, movie producers in California with children with diabetes, and Bob Klein, your neighbor, Robert Klein, who has a child with diabetes and was on the board of JDRF, and they got together and thought of Prop 71. Now this, I have to just talk about because I'm in California, I don't get here that often. Prop 71 is a phenomenal piece of work, unimaginable. Bob Klein, the architect of this, was a genius. He invested some $7 million of his own money in this campaign. He built an impregnable legal fortress that could not be torn apart by politicians in Sacramento to create an institute to do this. Now, when it was passed and the foes of the research filed lawsuits to hold it up, spurious lawsuits, he would not be denied. He came up with an idea of getting the state to issue special notes and get bridge funding, some $39 million of bridge funding from philanthropic types to get this whole field started. And now, even in this deepest crisis that you had, where none of your state bonds are being sold, Bob has gotten permission for private bonds to be sold that will be taxable, that might bridge the gap so the CIRM will not have to turn off its lights. This is critical work that's happening in California. This has become a mecca for research and scientists, which is the envy for around the world. And you need to know that the seeds of our economic recovery are coming from this diamond point of biotechnology innovation, which is stem cell research, regenerative medicine. One day it'll be a $500 billion industry. It's a paradigm shift. And the seeds are being planted in California. Thank goodness for California. Very, very significant work. And Bob, I don't believe, gets half the credit that he does because he's such a hard-working guy to do this, mainly on his own dime. You're very fortunate. He's actually a national treasure, so that's my plug for Bob Klein today and what you're doing in California. It's very, very significant. So what do we find now with this nascent industry? And now that President Obama has lifted the fundamental restriction on this, perhaps we who are advocates, can we just stack the rifles, fold the tents, go back to the farms? I think not. Because the opponents of stem cell research are not going to let this rest. They have indicated that they are going to initiate actions in every state to try to curtail it so it cannot go forward. So the Georgia Senate passed a bill that would prevent embryonic stem cell research from going forward in Georgia. The folks that are hosting the annual bioconference in Atlanta aren't too happy about that. In Nebraska, we find the same thing. There's also stem cell research going on there. So we who are advocates for this research realize that this fight must go on. The Genetics Policy Institute, my group, has created something called the Stem Cell Action Coalition. And if you go to our website at genpol.org, genpol.org, you will see a stem cell action campaign where you can sign up and get the stem cell action news. We're trying to aggregate 1 million names to wield influence because the internet is so powerful that the policymakers will listen if we organize ourselves and if you're in favor of this research. Also, we have to figure out a way that this fundamental research in the lab can be translated into treatments. That's going to require private investment, venture capital, perhaps even government intervention, so it doesn't go into what they call the valley of death, so that these nascent companies can move forward in this field. And it's not only for embryonic stem cells. These companies in adult stem cells and other cell therapies and related companies need to be able to move forward, or else we'll cure a mouse of diabetes, but we'll still have the chronic disaster that diabetes represents. I would advise you, by the way, to all follow your regimen of healthy water drinking and the other things that you're doing so we'll all live long enough to be able to take advantage of the regenerative medicine revolution that is upon us. I thought I would add, since I have a little more time, to talk to you a little bit about the ethics of stem cell research. Yes, sir?
So what happened to the debate?
What happens to what?
The debate that you had with the guy.
The debate that I have with Dr. Prentice with the football, I beat him like a drum. It was a spirited debate. And you know, and I think there are very strong arguments, as I made to you, that this is a false alternative argument. It's not the right argument to be using against this research. And your comment is welcome, because how do we address the morality of embryonic stem cell research? You know, if you view that this is a potential person, it's one thing. But if you view these embryos in a dish as persons, if you have a consistent view about this, then shouldn't we curb in vitro fertilization practice, or shut that down where you're creating these embryos and tossing them away? If they're not viable, you're going to toss them away. And if you do that, we would also live in a society that surely would ban first trimester abortions. And I don't want to tie the issues together, but where does life begin is the fundamental question. By my own view, I would put the fence at a point that can save the most lives, And since the debate goes about where does life begin, the rules about when you can use an embryo, usually the cutoff day, the rules say, are day 14, when the primitive streak, the beginning of a spinal cord, begins. And you don't want to have these undifferentiated cells have any way of suffering or feeling. But these are microscopic dots, and if you ask the public what an embryo looks like, they're not going to make a dot. Sometimes they'll draw little faces and arms and legs. But I'm not saying that these embryos don't have potential life. And I'm not saying they aren't human life. I'm saying, in my view, they're not persons. And it's a serious business considering what these goods really are. The law has an interesting way of dealing with these issues because lawyers have to deal in real life. And how does the law treat this? We find it in divorce cases, where there are fights over who gets the surplus embryos that are frozen. And some courts have been encouraged to adopt a view that these embryos are persons, and you have to use the best interest of the child test as you would in a divorce case. But courts uniformly, all the appellate decisions say, no, we're going to use the laws of personal property and bailment. You know, we're not going to view these embryos as persons. So in the real world, it's being pragmatic. I've never heard a good argument that's been made that says where an embryo is going to be donated to science with the proviso it's cannot be implanted in a womb, that it's better off just to toss it away than use it for medical research that couldn't benefit mankind, no matter what the principles are. And I would frame the issue as a Harvard philosopher, Louis Gennon, has in a book that's a little tough sledding. It's called The Morality of Embryo Use, Louis Gennon. And in The Morality of Embryo Use, Lou proposes that a viewpoint of there is something called the unenabled embryo. And he thinks the debate should be reframed in a way that even if you are a social conservative or evangelical or devout Catholic, you may see that this is morally permissible. So what Mr. Gennon suggests is if a couple donates an embryo for scientific research with the proviso that it's not to be implanted in a womb, there's only one use. The embryo could be destroyed. It has no feelings. It's an undifferentiated clump of cells. And it cannot be a corresponding human being. It cannot develop. We aren't going to implant it in the womb. Rather than see it perish and waste, where there's a moral imperative to help one's neighbor, and this could produce some sort of life-saving research. So therefore, it is morally permissible, no matter what your view of the embryo is, whether it's a person or none. For indeed, there's no moral duty for a woman to take an embryo and place it in her womb. You can't compel a woman to do that. And should the state really be involved? Do we want the state to be involved in such a private decision as this? These are the questions that could be reframing this altogether. Now, I have to tell you, the news was last week, the Dickey-Wicker Amendment, by the way, passed again. No debate whatsoever. Why? Because the proponents in Congress in favor of embryonic stem cell research, in my view, are not farsighted enough to realize that this rate restriction should be overturned. There's no appetite in American politics to challenge it right now. It's a road that's going to happen in the future. Now, I want to discuss, and I think I have a few minutes more, I want to discuss another issue that might bring things of more interest to this group who are interested in hearing about medical treatments. And again, I'm only Bernie Seigal, the lawyer, not the doctor, but I want to talk a little bit about medical tourism for a second, because it's a hot issue related to this field. What about if you're suffering from a chronic illness? You can't get stem cell treatments impacting your illness in the United States. There haven't been approved clinical treatments. But you see an advertisement to go to Panama and saying for $50,000 you're going to get a shot. Should you go? Should you not go? Or you see an advertisement on the internet to go to Beike Biotech, for example, and some of the hospitals in China where they are giving stem cell treatments with cord bloods. And there are a lot of anecdotal stories that this is working. But there you would be going to a hospital at a university where they would give you follow-up treatment. And you've been told that this is approved by the Chinese FDA. Is it safe or ethical for you to go there? Or to Dr. Shroff in India, whose claims to be...
What's the cost?
What's the cost? A good question. Usually you find these injections to be $10,000, $20,000, $50,000. You might even be having a future speaker soon who's providing treatments in some country other than the United States. And I'm not here to judge whether those treatments are valid or they're not valid. In fact, if anything, I am on the side of the patient. And I feel that if you are getting treated by a physician, you alert your physician as to what you're doing. You research up and down what you're getting done. Understand what happens if something goes bad. Is this in a hospital, an accredited hospital? Will you take care of me after this injection? How am I to know what is being injected? But I will say this, by and large, you're going out on very, very thin ice. Very, very thin ice. You don't know exactly what's happening. And you certainly, unless you're dealing with an accredited hospital in some government-approved facility, be extremely cautious. And you should ask questions. You can go to the website, and somewhere in the website of the International Society of Stem Cell Research, which is isscr.org, isscr.org. And you do maybe Google, put that in with a Google search of medical tourism. You will find what they are saying needs to be done, because most of these tests, most of these treatments have not been done with published clinical trials. So that's why you're not going to find this as allowed in the United States. Be careful, by all means, of what you're doing. And I would submit to you there are some places that are doing treatments that are totally fraudulent, totally bogus, and if it's being done with something you've been told are embryonic stem cells, you might want to run the other way. Because embryonic cells are undifferentiated. They could possibly turn into any kind of tissue in the body. So how do you know it's going to turn into the type of tissue that you need? I think you're being sold a bill of goods. Some of the cells are supposedly coming from the Ukraine and are from fetuses, aborted fetuses, separate from embryonic. Remember, we're talking a difference between cells in a dish and an aborted fetus. Well, they manufacture these cells. Well, there was a very alarming report that a boy from Israel went to the Ukraine for some type of treatment with fetal stem cells and came back with the tumor. So, but yet we hear these anecdotal stories. We just have to be consumer beware on these things. Before I take some questions, I want to acknowledge someone in the audience, my friend Ben Kaplan. Ben Kaplan back there, this very nice young man. Ben, I would give him a round of applause because I'm going to tell you a story about Ben. Ben is a hero of the stem cell revolution. When Prop 71 was being fought in the state, he appeared in an advertisement in favor of Prop 71 with his twin brother. And by a bad fate, Ben came out with brain damage at birth. Despite that, his brother is in perfect health. It hasn't stopped Ben. Ben is a graduate of Menlo College. He's a successful public relations person for biotechnology firms and is a leader of the advocacy community in stem cells as a speaker. His Ben Stem Cell News website is where many, many people go for their daily update on stem cell news. And my organization, which gives recognition through the Stem Cell Action Awards at our World Stem Cell Summit of Stem Cell Heroes, and we've honored Bob Klein and Michael J. Fox and the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. We're very proud to give our advocacy award to Ben Kaplan, who lives right here in Menlo Park. So thank you, Ben, for coming tonight. So if I may, I'll answer a few questions. Thank you. Now wait. I'm sorry. 3 minutes. Give me 3 minutes, and we're gonna try something. Remember I told you I met Christopher Reeve, or maybe I didn't? Okay. Now this is the point. If this doesn't work, you're gonna be mad at me. I met Christopher Reeve. When I did the UN conference, I wanted a patient advocate's voice. And I reached out to Christopher Reeve, who was kind enough to invite me to his home in Bedford, New York, and met me at the front door in his wheelchair and says, I will do a tape message for the United Nations. So I brought up a film crew to his house. This was 5 months before he died. And he comes to the door and he has no hair. His head is clamped to the back of the wheelchair. I thought like a Borg, like from Star Trek, and he could barely talk. And I was so honored that he would meet with me. And sure enough, he comes to the door and we work on a script together. And when it came time to do the taping, he had his attendant smooth down his sweater and move to the part of the room where we could have a dark background. And he did this 3-minute message. And if it plays, it's wonderful. If it doesn't play, because we had a problem at the Commonwealth Club yesterday, we'll just, I'll tell you about it. Okay. Okay, well, all right. We might glitch. Where's our sound on this? I understand it was the medicine he was taking. Okay, okay.
First, I want to thank my friend Bernie Seigal
I don't know where the speaker is on this.
and his remarkable organization, the Genetic
Is this on?
Policy Institute, for arranging this very important conference at the United Nations. And I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. Now, as representatives to the UN, all of you hold positions of enormous responsibility. You are perceived as the voice not only of the countries you represent, but as the collective moral voice of the world. Millions of patients just like me will be watching with great concern as you continue your important deliberations. Everyone I know of, including the scientists you'll hear from today, opposes the cloning of babies and the pursuit of reproductive cloning. But every leading scientist seeking cures calls for stem cell research to advance. Therapeutic cloning, also known as somatic cell nuclear transfer, offers real hope. The research is still in its infancy, but it has so much promise. And not to encourage the ethical pursuit of this research might result in needless human suffering and destroy the hope of those afflicted with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, spinal cord injuries, and a host of other conditions for which no cure is yet known. Countries around the world are grappling with this issue and deciding that the purpose of government is to do the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Countries can ban reproductive cloning and still live up to their obligation to provide the best medical technology to all citizens. I have a real concern that a great medical advance might be lost to humanity should the United Nations recommend a treaty that would prohibit this research. So my prayers are with you, and I hope that you'll make the right decision. A decision based on secular law and morally sound scientific knowledge that will provide hope to millions suffering all over the world. Thank you very much.
Lights. So, thank you.
Are sort of locked in this never land of they work or they not work because it's so prohibitively expensive to get any treatment. So really truly evaluating my FDA. I get angry when I look at a bottle of anything that says this is not FDA. I think that's the stop. How do you see this playing out for stem cell research?
Is the FDA an insurmountable bottleneck for stem cell research and other research? I'm not happy with our regulatory system. I think it's broken, and I think that the FDA swings in cycles, and where there's such a concern of litigation, and FDA goes slow, I think the greater good suffers by that. In stem cells, the Geron clinical trial took months and a change of administration and 22,000 pages of documentation before it was approved. If we are going to have clinical trials, they're going to monitor the entire life of a patient with related to cell therapies. Nothing will ever get through, and we will be relying on treatments in China and other countries where these things, clinical trials are going to be pushed through, because our system is not going to be geared to do it. So it's a real problem, and one of the things that we as a pro-cures movement can do is to try to compel the FDA to move forward in a swift fashion and fund it and fix it. That's my view. Yes, ma'am.
Can this research also be done with cells from discarded placentas, not embryos?
Sure. Can this research be done with discarded placentas or cord blood and umbilical cord donations? And yes, this is part of regenerative medicine, but you have to understand that the blood cells, let's say from umbilical cord blood cells, are very potent and are adults, essentially adult stem cells. And they have some use and potency and value, apparently, in some treatments, and we're beginning to find out more and more. But it's only one tool of the toolkit that we're going to be used. They are not pluripotent. They can't turn into every kind of cell in the human body. So I think you, as aware consumers, need to know that there's a lot of fundamental research, laboratory research, that needs to be done, and to compare cell types and then find the right cell types that might be applicable to use. I also want to add that the pharmaceutical companies are now really investing in stem cells. You might be surprised at that, but they see human embryonic cells, Pfizer especially, as a tremendous tool. They're very stable cells for drug discovery. We might be able to save just humongous, large sums in clinical trials if we can study the reaction of drugs in a petri dish as opposed to putting them into living human beings, and as a safety factor as well. Also, we'll be able to target cell lines that are burdened with specific diseases and study the root causes of diseases. So even the pharmaceutical companies are now venturing in this. Question, sir?
Yeah, how are the veterinarians doing as far as using stem cells for curing animal disease?
How are veterinarians doing? Actually, it's interesting. There is a company that I'm aware of, I don't remember the name, that is using stem cells for animals. Of course, we're doing so many animal studies, and obviously it's very promising results in animals. Now, whether it gets into widespread use, I don't know. I know of one private company that's doing it. I don't recall the name of it. Yes, sir?
I think I saw in the last month a breakthrough that might moot a lot of these things that we've been talking about tonight. I think I saw a report that they found a procedure that will take skin cells and undifferentiate them to pluripotent stem cells. Have you seen that?
Yes. The question and comment is that there's a report of other cell types that might obviate the whole debate. And I want to discuss that. And I described to you embryonic stem cells, right, from surplus IVF embryos, and I described this therapeutic cloning. The new thing that has scientists so excited is Dr. Jamie Thompson, who originated human embryonic stem cell research, and Dr. Shinya Yamanaka in Japan have published papers related to something called IPS cells, induced pluripotent cells. Yeah. And let me just tell you what that is. But I'll say up front, the scientists are telling us that the human embryonic cells are the gold standard for which we need to compare. And Dr. Yamanaka and Dr. Thompson have said without human embryonic stem cell research, these IPS cells could have never been developed, but they hold great promise. We take another one of my 100 trillion cells, now I have 2 less of them, skin cells, an ordinary skin cell. And what Dr. Yamanaka does is he transports via viruses 4 genes into the cell directly. Notice, no egg, no embryo, no fertilization, my ordinary cell, and transforms it into an embryo-like state of pluripotency. It's not the same as a human embryonic stem cell, but it looks and tests pluripotent. Incredible. That means we don't need to do this therapeutic cloning, perhaps. We'll be able to test these cells if we can strip the viruses away and have it genetically matched the donor. So It's a tremendous field. It's not ethically challenged in any way whatsoever. Well, if you think about it, there are potential concerns, and I heard it again last night from a scientist at the meeting at the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine. They've been able to take this in a mouse and actually turn it into a whole mouse. What's that? You're able to take a single cell from a living mouse and then create a whole nother mouse out of it? That means it's totipotent. Does that mean we could turn one of my cell into another human being? That really hasn't been discussed that much in the ethics journals. It's stuff that we have to make sure we know what we're doing. But however, just on research in a Petri dish, there should be no challenge that this is very important. But I would say this, the message for you is that this is just another tool in our toolkit. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
One of the things I find of interest is, you know, you talk about fertilization, you have the embryo and all this. How does anything know what it's supposed to be? That's the question that bothers me continually. How does somebody know it's going to be a liver, it's going to be a heart, it's going to be, you know, an aorta, it's going to be a, you know, how does all that memory bank, where's that coming from?
Where in our DNA does a cell know to differentiate into a neuron or to a liver cell or to a blood cell? That's the fascinating thing, and this is what scientists want to understand, because we want to be able to find that switch in the cell to create the type of cells we need to perhaps repopulate the damaged tissue in our bodies. And arguably, an embryonic stem cell divides and divides and divides almost in an inexhaustible supply. So they're scaffolds, decellularized organs that they want to populate cells to grow into new tissue. Doris Taylor's work at the heart in Minnesota is absolutely incredible. I spoke to a head of a company with a technology. This is just amazing. He created nanochips the size of viruses, each with a different shape and chemical coating. And he is telling me that it's the shape and the three-dimensional shape that a cell touches, and that will trigger a differentiation into a specific type of cell. And this is a new technology that's going to be presented soon. The array of things in science are so incredible, it's mind-boggling. So differentiation and the pathway to that is a critical thing, and scientists have found ways to differentiate embryonic stem cells into neurons. We are learning, but what is the best way to do it and the reasonable way to do it so we can rebuild damaged tissues and organs? It's an ongoing project.
I just think last night there was 3 scientists that spoke, and one spoke about cartilage regeneration, where 50% of people over 65 years old have cartilage degeneration going on and a lot of pain. So I just want to say that was the most fascinating thing, having a mother-in-law that's having double knee replacement in a couple weeks. But that's 4 years away with stem cell technology in the guesstimation of this researcher at UCSF. So I thought that was sort of like a relevant factoid related to stem cells. And
I'm definitely going to be drinking my vegetable juice to take advantage of that as much as I can. Thank you very much. Oh, wait a minute, one more question. One more question.
What country in the world made the greatest advances in stem cell research since our scientists were forced to do their research?
Yeah, what country has made the greatest? I'm not going to judge which country. We have tremendous scientists here, and we're making.
I know that. I'm asking you, what other countries during the last 8 years seem to have made the greatest estimate contribution?
Sure. The countries that I always look to are the United Kingdom, in Scotland in particular, Israel, and we see I would say tremendous work now in China and in Singapore are the countries where perhaps we've seen the greatest advances. Yes, sir?
What was that, I guess, website that it was to support your effort?
Yes, it's at genpol.org, short for Genetics Policy, GENPOL.org. And find on the side, it says Stem Cell Action. Find the page for Stem Cell Action. And if you sign up for it, just give us your email address, and we will put you on the list of the Stem Cell Action News, so we can keep it in your inbox. You'll learn every month or twice a month what's going on in the stem cell world. Yes, ma'am.
You and the group might find this interesting. I went to the Lyme support group, Lyme disease, just about a week ago. I haven't been there for a long time, maybe months. And so this was new to me. And this one young woman had just come back. Well, she's been back a while, I guess, but she had gone recently to India and had stem cell treatment done in India for her Lyme disease. And she had the treatment for Lyme disease, probably a lot of you know already, that it's heavy, long doses of antibiotics. And she had been on antibiotics for a long time, and she's been off antibiotics now as a result of this, and off them for several months now. So she's been home. So because what it did was it restored her immune system. So I just thought you might like to hear that story.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
You said you had a colon cancer. Did you with chemotherapy and radiation?
Usually I don't talk about it that much, but this group is a pretty open group. Yeah, I had adjuvant chemo for a few months and some radiation treatment as a result of that. And it was very mild compared to what a lot of people go through. And I don't know if anyone in here has ever had cancer, and it is being part of a fraternity or sorority we would rather not belong to, right? But it's to me, it was the knock on the door that, you're not going to last forever, okay? Live life to the fullest, live it with joy to your heart, and live it with a purpose. And that was the message that I got out of this. And that's why I decided to do what I do. Whatever.
Change your lifestyle about it?
I work harder. Thank you.
Same here.
Oh,
Thank you.
that was really great.
Okay, thank you.
Personal trainer, and he's going to be giving a short presentation on hydration and rehydration. You might as well come up now, Jake. So we'll save time and you can take more on the presentation.
Great. Actually, that would be good. Perhaps a little contrast. I have
front lights.
I took advice from the last presentation and changed some font colors in that to help people see a little better. Anyway, thank you for having me back so soon. I was hoping it had something to do with a great presentation. Mr. Corey disabused me of that immediately and told me, no, somebody just didn't show up. Okay, I'm the second line guy here. Last time we began a conversation about healthology, which is basically my emphasis on this issue of the science and practice of things that promote and preserve good health. From my perspective, I think that's a very important paradigm to consider health from. I mentioned, described a broader perspective last time about the 7 vital practices that are to supply our 7 vital needs. Today we'll talk about the first of those 7 vital needs, which is hydration. What I'd like to leave you guys with today is 3 things. Number 1, to really be clear about the fact that we're constantly losing water. 24/7, our body is losing water. Number 2, it doesn't take much
water loss. And number 3, chronic and severe dehydration can create some serious complications that I don't think are really often addressed enough, such as diabetes, such as altering hormonal profile in the body by lowering testosterone and elevating estrogen, malnutrition, osteoporosis, even inflammation, and ultimately I'll talk briefly about potentially even affecting longevity. We'll talk about that a little bit. So anyway, today it's about water. Healthology, this is the quote that encapsulates the perspective I'm looking at our health from, which is no medicine, but food, fresh air, exercise, and those things. And that's what healthology is about. Principles of healthology, I just quickly want to review this. We talked about this last time. Number 1, that our body naturally strives to be well. That's one of the tenets. Number 2, that good health is a spontaneous outcome of fulfilling our vital needs. The vital needs that we have are oxygen, water, nutrients, movement, detoxification, rest, exposure to sunlight, and psychological ease. 7 things there.
Item 3, the first word, which I can't read.
Yes.
Says our something.
I agree with you. It says vital need. Or needs, I'm sorry. Vital needs. I apologize. I try to do a better job with the contrast here, but I'll have to refine it further. Anyway, we have vital practices. Modern man is living such an unnatural life. We have to take a very conscious effort, a mindful, intentional effort to meet these vital needs through vital practices. And these are proper hydration, correct diet and exercise, detoxification, rest and recovery, some sun time, and right thinking. Number 5, this is an important point just to kind of remind us that we are participants, regardless if we choose to be or not to be. We're always participating. Number 5 talks about that we either promote or oppose the body's intrinsic wellness tendencies through our choices and behaviors. So we cannot not participate. It's just a matter of how you want to participate, to support or to oppose the body's ability to heal and be well. And the last one, perhaps a bit controversial, that chronic and severe vital needs deficiencies are precursors to all diseases. And I will demonstrate bits and pieces of that today for you to consider. We have a limited amount of time, so we'll try to be brief. I think this is a very important statement. I think that we are casual about our understanding of what role water plays in the body and how vital of a role it plays in the body. Therefore, I really think that it is the forgotten nutrient. A point that I'm trying to convey here, that even a tiny shortage of water disrupts, is the operative word here, disrupts our body chemistry. So it's very important to understand that. That's why I emphasized those 3 points earlier. Water and constitution, just a few things about where water is in the body. Yes, it has no calories. It's a vital nutrient. Largest component of the body, 75% of an infant's body weight, 55 to 60% of an adult's body weight. 2/3 contained in the cells, 1/3 contained outside around the cells in blood plasma and other body fluids. Additionally, about 65 to 75% of muscle weight is water, 25% of fat. A loss of 9 to 12% of body weight can lead to death. And just for those people who are marathon runners, keep in mind that regardless of how much hydration you take during a run, marathon runners are in this dehydration range. And it's a very risky proposition. You got to really be sure to be on top of your water. Again, emphasizing how little it takes to be dehydrated. 1% of body weight and the body can become dehydrated. It's a very small amount. Vital physiology, a few things that the body does. This is where I'm going to describe a few deficiencies and pathological outcomes. Blood plasma is about 92% water. It's a suspension and transport medium for nutrients, hormones, and gases. It's a necessary solvent for detoxification, for proper pH balance in the body, major determinant of blood pressure and cardiovascular function, facilitates dissipation of body heat. This is an interesting point I'm going to talk about a little bit more, a little later on. Healthy body weight is another really interesting topic with regard to dehydration because it really can create some significant problems in the body. The lubrication of joints and promotion of joint health, we won't really talk much about that. And form and structure of the body, again, that's just one of the things. Even a slightly dehydrated body can actually induce shrinkage of the brain. Think about that. Thereby impairing neuromuscular coordination, concentration, and thinking. Literal physical shrinkage of the brain. I think this is important to note. Variables of water need. A few things that may increase our need for water. The foods we eat, the type of diet we have can really be a very dehydrating diet. A metabolic rate, the greater the metabolic rate, the greater our water need. Weather, temperature, and climate, those environmental factors that can ask us to keep ourselves cool or warm, which can take more water than usual. Physical activity requires more water. And stress, I want you to think about stress as being a diuretic, because it is. This is an interesting point, again, emphasizing how little, how important dehydration and how little it takes to dehydrate the body. Essentially, I like the analogy of a bicycle tire that has a microscopic leak in it. You can never repair it because you can't even find it, but constantly this leak is there. That's really how our body, how our body actually loses water. It always does. It's an ongoing, irreparable leak. Some signs of dehydration: dry mouth and decreased production of saliva. Fatigue is a very important point. We'll talk about that a little later on. Concentrating, any type of cognitive impairment. There are a few things that are related, as the preceding slide mentioned, once you have that dehydration and corresponding brain shrinkage. This false appetite is an interesting point I'll talk about a little bit more. The chronic feeling of hunger where you just can't find yourself sated. You keep wanting to eat more and more. Infrequent urination. If you have muscle tension such as headaches, low backache, that kind of stuff, it's amazing how much water can help resolve those issues. Shortness of breath is an interesting point that the body actually uses as a tactic to preserve water levels once it's dehydrated. Irregular bowel movements and increased heart rates. This is an interesting point for those of you who fly much. A 3 to 4 hour flight, and you may lose up to 2 pounds of water. So, be aware of that. I like to remind people that you want to drink some water before you get on a plane. I know people who don't like to drink too much on a plane, but before and after, you must hydrate. Okay, channels of water loss. Quickly, sensible water loss, insensible water loss, the two main channels. Basically, the sensible water loss is 70% of the daily loss. We've got urination, we've got sweat loss, and large intestine loss. Okay? Insensible water loss is a little bit more difficult to perceive, hence the name. 20% is skin evaporation and 10% respiratory function. I grew up in Chicago. On a cold day, you exhale and you see the mist. That's water loss right there with every breath. The interesting thing is these numbers tally up to 2,500 milliliters, 2.5 liters, and that's for a 155-pound person. 155-pound person. If you exercise for an hour intensely, you increase that by another 1.5 liters, 1,500 milliliters. And then you can adjust these numbers if you're above or below 155 by adding 6 ounces per 15 pounds of body weight, if you want to estimate your own numbers. Sources of water gain, traditional estimates, I'm going to comment a little bit about this later on. 60% from fluid ingestion, 30% from watery foods, and 10% from metabolic processes. These estimates, I believe, are descriptive, that is, looking at the general population. I'm not sure, in my opinion, they should not be prescriptive, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Dehydration and disease, this is an interesting point. I want to get through a couple of these for you. Complications from altered hemoviscosity. Basically, what happens when the body dehydrates and the blood gets thicker? There's some interesting things that happen. Number 2, impaired adipose metabolism. When a body is dehydrated, you can't lose weight, but there's some other things that happen as a consequence. Very interesting things. Complications from detoxification mechanisms. We won't talk about that today. Thermal elevation is another point. If I have time, I'll bring up. Hemoviscosity, basically, as I said, we're looking at blood that has been dehydrated and it's gotten thicker. Some of the points I'm making here have actually been observed in orthopedic science or medicine. And so applying them here, basically what happens is you have transport mechanisms that are impaired, and in essence, transport rates are altered. So you eat a complex carbohydrate meal, it ends up as glucose in your blood, and at that point, instead of going out of your blood to meet cellular need, it doesn't do that. In fact, there is actually a backup, a nutritional backup, if you will, a glucose pooling in this case. What does that do? Well, that's hyperglycemia. And what does hyperglycemia do? It seems to get the body to secrete insulin, and therefore leads to hyperinsulinemia. So there are some observations that have been made with researchers that have shown that simply hydrating the body adequately normalizes blood sugar levels. Something we should know. Impaired nutrient delivery, same thing, basically. Nutrients that get into the blood that can't get out quick enough. And essentially, if you have a need for 5 units of something in the body, and the body can deliver it only at 3 units at a time, over time you have a deficiency. It can lead to a nutritional deficiency. And the nutrient pooling is again, a consequence as well. Impaired oxygen delivery. Oxygen is essential for energy production in the body. So, if you're not delivering oxygen at normal rates or at healthy rates, what happens? Well, you have things such as chronic fatigue building up. It's amazing how fatigued people can get just from being dehydrated, not knowing they are, because they've been chronically in that state. Underactivity. When the body is dehydrated, it doesn't want you to exert yourself. It can't afford the heat, the cooling, and all the metabolic wastes that are produced. And so in essence, you get hypokinetic, you get underactive, you get sedentary. This simply is a negative feedback loop that promotes other negative things to happen that increase dehydration. So we've got carbon dioxide, one of the metabolic wastes. That not being removed quick enough lowers body pH. And that can be pretty serious. If the body, in the body's attempt to maintain this pH balance, it will revert to alkalinizing nutrients, such as calcium carbonate, zinc, magnesium, in order to maintain, to strain and maintain this pH balance, because the CO2 buildup is artificially lowering it. So it's leading to things like osteoporosis, nutritional deficiencies, etc. Pretty serious stuff, I think. Adipose metabolism is kind of interesting. Quickly here, by having a false appetite, people have a tendency to overeat. By overeating, people have a tendency to put on weight. Now, what's interesting about that, the weight gain in the body that's dehydrated is kind of a permanent state, because the body needs hydration. It needs to resynthesize certain molecules in order for fat to be released and used for energy. So essentially what happens is when you're dehydrated, you'll notice you're gaining weight and you can't take it off. The other thing that's interesting is because the body releases water when weight is added to existing fat stores, it's a means of gaining the precious water it needs. So it actually becomes easier to gain weight when you're dehydrated. We also have one final point that I'm going to bring up, which is just the aromatase enzyme production. Adipose tissue is very active in aromatase. That actually takes testosterone, converts it to estrogen. So in a sense, dehydration, which leads to weight gain, presence of adipose tissue leads to aromatase level increase, and all of a sudden we're affecting our hormonal profile. Again, once estrogen levels are increased, we have additional problems with that as well. That also promotes weight gain and other things. Thermal dysregulation, I'll say this quickly as well. Body temperature increases when the body is not well hydrated. It is actually increasing its normal temperature. What happens there is cellular processes are increased. If you look at any research in caloric restriction, which has been, research has been done over the last 75 years, one of the attributes behind caloric restriction, which is actually reducing of calories in order to extend, prolong longevity, one of the mechanisms that's been identified is the fact that the body temperature drops. And that seems to slow down metabolic processes. When we are dehydrated, we're doing the exact opposite. We're accelerating cellular processes. So in effect, could we be aging more quickly, and could we in fact be affecting our longevity? I think it's quite possible. Compensatory mechanisms. So we have increase of minerals to normalize the pH. So where is the pH dysregulation that's happening here? The malnutrition, the osteoporosis mechanisms, increased use of minerals to normalize. Let me see where. I'm sorry, the metabolic acids and the CO2 levels are elevated because of increased metabolic activity. So, because cellular processes are increased, greater metabolic activity, greater acid production, greater CO2 production, that lowers pH. And the body again resorts to minerals to normalize that, leading to things such as nutritional deficiencies. Let's go ahead on and talk about recommendations. The fact that we have a false appetite, I think, is very telling. And it's telling in the following way. In my opinion, the most important way to hydrate your body is not to drink water. It's actually to eat your water. And that's a very important distinction. The reason you have a false appetite is your body's basically saying, hey, eat, because if you eat the right food, you're going to bring me water. That's why it's activating that appetite. When we eat dehydrated foods, the body is basically saying, no, 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 give me more food. And it's an ongoing, insatiable appetite we have. So what we want to eat is high water content vegetables, fruits, soups, and stews. These are the most important things in our diet. Drinking our water, yes, important, but not in the same level of importance. Filtered alkaline water, fresh or unconstituted organic vegetable juices. I have an item here that I'll quickly talk about again. Reducing diuretics, such as caffeine, alcohol, carbonated beverages, and other things, including, again, I mentioned stress. And then reducing intake of dehydrated foods. What's interesting is if we ingest dehydrated foods, our body takes water from other areas and other applications, rehydrates that food, and keeps that food hydrated the entire time it's traversing the digestive tract. And that can be, for people that are really dehydrated, for days the water is tied up in that. So it's an additional source of dehydration. Here are the recommendations also further. As far as drinking water with meals, I recommend you eat your water that's in food. Drinking water with meals, I discourage. I think that it dilutes digestive enzymes and diminishes our digestive powers. You can test this for yourself. I definitely experienced this years ago, having to drink water while eating, and all of a sudden you get a stomach ache and other things. Here's the intake distribution that I was talking about earlier that I think is the correct distribution. Instead of 60-30-10, I recommend 35 to 40 from fluid and 55 from your food. So a higher percentage. What I'd like you guys to think about is eating your water more. More about eating your water. And the metabolic production, I really think when the body is hydrated well, essentially, it doesn't need to produce metabolic water to meet those deficiencies, which it does rely on to do. Okay, here's a daily hydration schedule. All I want you guys is to consider this to do the best you can. Any amount in this direction will improve your hydration situation. I'm not expecting you to do all this, and if you don't, you failed. First thing I recommend is upon waking up, first thing in the morning, 16-ounce glass of water. You walk over, whatever your source of water is, you fill that glass up, and you drink it within 5 to 10 to 15 minutes. Very important. 30 to 60 minutes later, when you have breakfast, we want to introduce some of that water through our food. I talk about here 8 ounces of vegetable juice. This is the only vegetable juice I recommend other than fresh squeeze. If you can do fresh squeeze, you're better off, yeah. Okay? This is a great product. It's the only product out there that I've seen that has some of the attributes, such as basically fresh squeezed and not reconstituted. Okay? It's called Liquid Super Veggie Juice. Only one place in this area carries it, and that's Country Sun. You might be able to get it up in the city or down at Staff of Life in Santa Cruz, but I know around here only Country Sun carries it. That 8-ounce vegetable juice beverage would be a part of your breakfast. The other part, and again, I don't care what the third part is. The one thing I would recommend is the vegetable juice, 8 ounces, and then 50% of the meal to be high water content food, whatever that means for you. Maybe an orange. I happen to be a little unconventional. I'll eat cucumbers and celery and even lettuce and other things. I just enjoy that. That may not fit your expectations, but to whatever degree you can eat high water content food for breakfast, 50% of that meal, that would be outstanding.
Did you say drink the juice with your meal?
Yes, yes. This, for some reason, works really well. It just seems to give you a lot of good stuff, and it does not have that effect that if you just drink a straight glass of water with your meal. It seems to go right along with the digestive processes, which I think is related to the fact that you've got minerals and digestive elements there. 2 hours after that breakfast meal, I recommend you have 1 or 2 apples or equivalent high water fruit. There you go again, you're eating your water. Okay? 30 minutes before lunch, great idea. 30 minutes before lunch, get in the habit of drinking just 8 ounces of water. If you know you're going to have lunch at noon, at 11:30, just take 8 ounces of water and take it down. It helps you regulate appetite, helps you meet your hydration goals, etc. For lunch, all I care about is that high water content percentage. 50% of the meal to be high water content food. What does that mean for me? Just a big salad. If you want to eat McDonald's, I'm not going to comment on that today. That's not what we're talking about here. But the half of the meal that's not McDonald's, high water content food. So, lots of great veggies out there, and we live in a marvelous area. If you haven't discovered some of the farmers markets around here, they're wonderful. 3 hours after lunch, once again, I recommend those 1 or 2 apples. Now, you might notice by hydrating this way, you're actually improving your eating habits. And that's an added benefit. All of these 7 disciplines that I will be talking about one way or another actually interact and promote each other. So correct hydration promotes correct diet. 3 hours past lunch, we've got that 1 to 2 apples. 60 minutes later, again, drink some water, no later than 5 p.m. If you want to do 16 ounces, 8 to 16 ounces, great. Just drink some water by 5 p.m. and at that point, be done with your water for the day. The last meal of the day, dinner, again, my only concern is 50% high water content meal. If you would like to, as an option, to introduce the super veggie juice, great. But if not, you'll have plenty of water here. Do the best you can with this. What I would recommend is starting 1 or 2 of these disciplines until they become a habit. Then introduce 1 more, then 1 more. Before you know it, this just becomes a way of life. This is not an imposition. You may look at this and say, well, geez, this is such an imposition. That's because you're so far away from doing this, which you should be doing to some degree anyway. In conclusion, basically going back to this whole issue of healthology, good health results from fulfilling these vital needs, hydration being the first of 7. Good health is a choice, 1 decision at a time. If you decide to take up some of these hydration recommendations, I think you'll definitely see the benefit, no doubt about that in my mind. And the daily commitment to these vital practices is really our insurance policy towards health, happiness, and longevity. I don't want to think about insurance rates are going up or what the next solution medical science is coming up with. I like to be a little bit more self-empowered and to do things that I know can promote my health and significantly reduce my risk of needing that intervention. Remember, happiness lies first of all in health. And this is my contact information. If you have any questions, feel free to reach me either at jake.infit@gmail or at my telephone number there. And thank you so much for your time. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Hold it. My apologies. Anyway, thank you so much. It's been great. Yeah, good point. Here's the thing. It's a difficult question to answer because if your body is really has accumulated much salt and other things, the first thing that's going to happen once you start hydrating properly, you're going to be expelling a lot. And you may think that that means I'm drinking too much water, when in essence you've finally given your body a chance to catch up. So be patient with that. The only thing I recommend is don't drink too late, because by doing that, that may interrupt your sleep. The 5 p.m. cutoff, I think, is a pretty good cutoff.
What is too late mean?
I'm sorry?
You said too late.
Well, what I'm saying is
Too late means what?
if you drink water at 8 or 9 or 10 p.m., you may end up having to get up several times during the night and have a difficult time getting back to sleep. So I think 5 p.m., maybe no later than 6, is a good cutoff. Yes?
Is there a difference in different types of water?
Absolutely. That's a whole other subject matter. My whole thing is get pure water, some type of filtration system. I believe in the adage that if you don't have a filter, you are the filter. So get some kind of filtration system. And alkalinizing water, I think, it just makes a lot of sense to me. I've actually hyperalkalinized myself, you know, where you get the tingling nerve sensations and stuff like that. So I've experimented with that, and I think it's a beneficial practice. Yeah, go ahead.
The super veggie juice, I guess, who's the brand?
Oh, Lockwood. I'm sorry, Lakewood. Yeah, Lakewood. Thank you.
How much did you say to drink with the meal? Was it
8 ounces would be good. If you want to start a little less, if you know what's kind of interesting, when you hydrate properly, you might notice that has a positive effect on your appetite, meaning you feel less motivated to eat more. So if you drink 8 ounces of this, you might end up eating less some other things that you've been having hard times, you know, kind of discontinuing. So you eat a little less of the bad stuff, if you will.
Jake, how much sugar is there in that 8 ounces?
Well, this is basically a vegetable-based beverage.
So it's,
Okay, so I don't recommend fruit juices, and certainly because it's flash pasteurized, I think it potentiates the sugars even more. So if you take a vegetable juice, I just am not a fan of it. I think that it's not really an ideal thing to do.
So it's okay for a type 1 diabetic?
I would think so. I can't say for sure. I mean, clearly, if you're a type 1, you're monitoring your blood, right? Therefore, introduce a little bit, see what impact you have. And I think trial and error, don't be afraid to try. Just try a little bit and see what happens. Yes, sir.
I'd like to contribute, Jake, a website called watercure.com and watercure2.com. The second one was the devotee of Dr. Botman Gellich, who wrote the book, Your Body's Many Cries for Water. But what he emphasizes, the second site, his student, is water and salt. And there's actually a book out called Water and Salt. And the ratio you need is approximately a teaspoon per gallon of water of sea salt, not table salt, because that's sodium chloride and causes water retention and can be bad for heart patients and so forth. But the mineral content of the sea salt is such that you can drink more water as long as you keep in mind to have the salinity of your body the same as a dolphin jumping in and out of the water. Except in this case, we're putting the water in and out of us as we go through the day. So.
What was that second website?
Watercure2.com. That's Bob Butts.
I have an alternative to the juice. On the YouTube channel, I went through all the blenders, and one of the blenders they demoed is called the BlendTech, and he blended his iPhone with it. And you can get the iPhone on eBay. Then he blended a ski and reduced it to dust. So I said, okay. So I got it at Costco, and then I went to Whole Foods and just got one of each vegetable, and you just plunk them in there and turn it on. It's sort of like an earthquake, but pretty much you get this great fresh juice comes out of it. And
better than juice. What you get is better than
the fiber, and you put it in your. I put a little vitamin C in it, so it doesn't oxidize.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I personally, I prefer that method. I introduced this because this is available out there and more convenient. But blending versus juicing, I definitely prefer blending. And Vitamix is another company that puts in a 2x4 and powderizes. I use Vitamix as well. Great idea. Yes, sir.
What's the relation between water intake and cancer probability?
Probabilities I can't say. Here's the thing. Today we talked about hydration without much emphasis on the detoxification mechanisms. Clearly, deficiency and toxicity seem to be very strongly involved in all diseases. Toxicity is just the body's inability to rid itself of toxins. When you're dehydrated, you clearly impair these mechanisms of detoxification. So no doubt in my mind when I said that I believe that deficiency of these vital needs or vital practices is a precursor to all disease, I really believe that. I really believe that dehydration is part of whatever other disease process. Yes, sir?
With regards to the vitamins, I have one as well. I was using a lot when I was making juice, mainly with fruit.
Yeah.
But you're saying go more with vegetable. What about mixing vegetables and fruit together? Is that good or bad? Or?
Great idea, except keep in mind that if you go very sweet vegetables with acidic vegetables, there may be some indigestion issues because of digestive incompatibility. Ideally, mixing some fruit with a lot of vegetables is your best way. If you look at the way chimpanzees eat greens in the wild, they'll actually take a piece of fruit and wrap it with something bitter and green, and will facilitate their palate that way so they can make something edible that isn't. I take the darkest shards in vast quantities and I put them in my blender. And I put some of my favorite pears in there or other things, and man, I love it. It's wonderful. It's a great idea. That's really.
It's okay to mix fruit with vegetables.
I think so. I think so. And again, I think the only thing to keep in mind is sweet fruit versus acidic fruit. Yes, Dave?
You also find if you use a chopper or a blender like that, it's a continuum from big pieces to smoothie basically made from vegetables. Every day for lunch, I eat a whole bunch of vegetables that are chopped into like smaller than BB, but it's actually a salad, which is a lot more packable than a juice, and it's a little more social than saying, I just drank my lunch, screw you guys. Like, you get the same moisture content that way, but you don't have to spend 2 hours chewing all those vegetables, which you would otherwise have to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's a great idea. The only thing I would say in both cases is, be careful of oxidation. If you take a vegetable and you cut it up and you leave it out there for a few hours, you're oxidating. You're exposing it. So, and I'm sure you're aware of that, and so therefore you just limit that. Yeah.
Along those lines, Jake, if you take a plastic knife you get at Whole Foods, it's serrated, and cut an apple in half and an avocado in half, they will stay green or clean and not turn brown for hours and hours and hours. When you use a metal knife, you immediately steal the electrical charge off the end, and that's why oxidation takes place.
Interesting.
And why I recommend, although I don't have one, I have a Vitamix myself, are the new juicers that use ceramic or magnetic blades inside, so you do not...
Basically using a non-metal blade.
Non-metal, yeah.
Creates a different effect when you're slicing.
There's more vitality in the juice that way.
And I think those you're addressing more visible signs of oxidation. I think just not chopping things up, too long before consumption. Did you?
Let's do one more.
Okay.
One more question.
Yes, please.
I am wondering how much compares to the rule that you drink half of your weight in ounces per water per day. So what you recommended, is it more or less?
What I'm recommending is a beginning regimen. So it'll be less. The thing is this, if you're thinking about ingesting water, I think you're missing out the bigger hydration potential of eating your water. And I think in some sense by eating your water, you're introducing kind of a structured water versus something that comes out of a tap, even purified and alkalinized. I just think that liquid coming out of those vegetables and fruits somehow seems to be more amenable to our digestive system. So however we can go closer to nature and away from our processes, I think we're better off. Hydration is no exception to that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very, very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. You guys can go.
Now, before you rush down here to get your water, on the papers I gave you for your opinions and what you want for speakers and if you want to just put down a topic you want discussed, please do that too. And you can put the papers, this is an assignment before you go home, you can put the papers, there's 2 chairs over here on either of the 2 chairs by the wall in the front, and then we'll get the information. And now we're going to take a 15-minute break, and then we'll have our speaker.
All right.